Good evening. I'm the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, an Associate Professor of Bible and the Director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at Union Presbyterian Seminary. And I'm grateful that you've joined us this evening as we have an incredibly important conversation: the Bible, theology, and Black Lives Matter. I'm pleased today to have such an august board of speakers. And before I do anything else, I want to introduce to you my colleague, the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Wilderness Leadership, professor of ethics and theology at Union Presbyterian Seminary, my colleague, Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to first begin our conversation tonight by providing some kind of brief remarks and to give us a sort of context about the Black Lives Matter movement as we prepare to have this exciting conversation. Hashtag Black Lives Matter emerged first as a protest hashtag that was developed by three young Black queer women, Alicia Garza, Opal Tameti, and Patrisse Cullors in 2012, that initially began as a knee-jerk response to the killing of a 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Florida and the troubling acquittal of George Zimmerman. On August 9, 2014, the killing of African-American male Michael Brown by white police officer Darren Wilson placed Ferguson, Missouri under a black light concerning race relations. It was not just that another unarmed 18-year-old young Black man had been shot by police that sparked attention, but it was also the disregard for Brown's body by authorities to leave his mangled body lying in the streets for close to 4 hours in the sweltering heat and the busiest street of the Canfield neighborhood. The shooting and abandoning of Brown's body became a glaring example of the denial of Black humanity and the misrecognition of Black existence in America. Martin and Brown's death, along with Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, and countless other fallen Black bodies to police brutality and their contested grand jury decisions since 2014, has reignited a Black resistance movement with the blending of innovative cyber and concrete demonstrations with the continuing aim to use the body as a means of protest to make Black Lives Matter in America. Thousands of protesters and activists under the banner of Black Lives Matter have organized, galvanized, and radicalized against the ugly and terrorizing reality of Black siblings, men, women, trans, gender nonconforming, facing dehumanization in life and in death. Leah Gunning Francis, author of Faith in Ferguson, Sparking Leadership and Awakening Community, she argues through an ethnographic account that to say that Black Lives Matter, quote, is to see Black people as human beings and not racist stereotypes, to affirm the human dignity and value of Black people as equal to other people, and to challenge the hearer or reader to consider what it means to create a social order that values the lives of Black people in all facets of their existence. The BLM movement's guiding principles center on themes such as celebration of difference, affirmation of LGBTQ folk and Black women, the linkage to the global concerns facing Black life, the recognition of collective value, the practicing of restorative justice, the promotion of Black villages and the Black family, fostering intergenerational dialogue, upholding loving engagement and empathy, and being unapologetically Black in the struggle for freedom. Black Lives Matter is the affirmation that Black bodies, women's, girls, men, boys, LGBTQ, differently abled bodies, Black bodies take up space, hold weight, gravitas, matter that cannot be ignored. In 2020, which has been deemed the summer of reckoning, in the wake of the racially disproportionate impact of the ongoing COVID pandemic, the recent events of police brutality from Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, to Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, to Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, George Floyd in Minneapolis, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, Georgia, Elijah McCain in Aurora, Colorado, and the many other acts of police and vigilante violence just during 2020 alone has heightened the sense that there is not only a Black Lives Matter movement, but there is a movement for Black lives that extends and is kind of developed beyond and within a multiplicity of organizations, grassroots activists, and organizers who are concerned about the need for Black lives to matter in America. It is true that America's holy grail in every area code that we can mark that there is terrorization of Black bodies, and this terrorization is sketched within the legal and moral fabric of this nation. In the face of America's domestically violent terror against Black bodies as a mechanism of control for Black life then and now, it is a sense that Black Lives Matter protesters have raised up the body as the very materiality that Black freedom activists continue to offer up to America as a sacred protest, to emphatically declare, "This is my body," or otherwise proof that we too are human and that Black life is sacred. Black Lives Matter has substantiated for us a sense of embodied protest in this social historical moment through forms of marching, adorning, blocking, and dying, all into what scholar Anthony Penn calls cultural artifacts of bodies in motion that are etched in the process of perpetual rebellion in efforts to make a better world. Though religious dissenters have erroneously deemed the movement as violent, this does not take into consideration that COVID-19 or the systemic racism that exists in America is already a violent mechanism against Black life. Thus, BLM activists and their quest for social disruption and disturbing the peaceful societal norms are all efforts to ward against or to rally against that which has kept Black life confined, contained, and ultimately placed in coffins as the starting points for embodied protests. The act of body blocking highways or protest demonstrations that break the rules of the mundane are not just to stand up to political leaders and authority, but it is also a way to expose that this is the realities of everyday folk who would otherwise drive by and look away from the tragedy that is facing Black life in America. I think it is important that we see the Black Lives Matter movement not just as a new movement, but that it belongs to the lineage of the American quest for freedom and a larger Black radical resistance tradition that we must herald, hold on to, and in many ways reclaim. The final word I'd like to consider, and it comes from the Black Lives Matter movement as one of its kind of artistic claims that it used during Black History Month and even during what has been named or hopefully named as Black Future Month, is this question or this phrase, "In the world where Black lives matter, I imagine." Perhaps this is a world that is yet to be seen, but it is a world that we desire to create and should also be a world that we consider for the opening and for the beginning of this conversation. So welcome to, again, Bible, Black Lives Matter, and Theology for the Just Talk, Talk Just series on tonight.
Thank you, Melanie. Welcome to Union Presbyterian Seminary's panel presentation on the Bible, Theology, and Black Lives Matter, the first in our Just Talk, Talk Just webinar series examining racial justice in America. We wish to thank Union Presbyterian Seminary, the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership for sponsoring today's forum. A few notes before we start. You are on mute by default. Only panelists will be speaking during the session. Use the chat feature to ask questions. Panelists will review them before being displayed publicly. This webinar is being recorded. We will share the link soon with you as soon as we are able, usually within 24 hours. If you experience technical difficulties or have questions, please email us at the address on your screen. Our panelists tonight are Dr. Brian K. Blunt, now in his 13th year as president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Valerie Bridgman, Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Homiletics and Hebrew Bible at Methodist Theological School in Delaware, Ohio. Dr. Will Gaffney, Professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Gail Henderson Belcito, a recent graduate of Union Presbyterian Seminary, Congregational Care and Worship Director at Caldwell Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and advisor for the seminary's Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Our host is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, instructor of ethics, theology, and culture, and director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. And our moderator is Dr. Rodney Sadler, Jr., associate professor of Bible and director of the seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. Dr. Sadler, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's, again, great to be back with this wonderful panel. I'm going to start you all off with an individual question, and then hopefully we'll get into more questions that will allow us some chance for dialogue. As we get started, I want to say that as we get into conversation, please feel free to jump in as you feel led. We want this to be a free-flowing conversation. Think of this as a Zoom version of a living room conversation. I want to start with the question for Dr. Brian Blunt, and I'm going to modify this just a little bit. What is the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement to Black faith? And should I also say, what is the significance of Black faith to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Thank you, Rodney. I want to begin by starting where Professor Jones ended, and that is to talk about the value of the Black Lives Matter movement for the understanding of the sacredness of Black life. And we begin with that. I think that's where we want to begin. Mm-hmm. And from a biblical perspective, and we know how important the biblical material is within the life of the Black church. From a biblical perspective, there are several images that are important to me that jump out at me, at least as I begin this conversation. The first is that of God as creator or divine parent, which signals the understanding that we are all in relationship with one another, that we are all kin to one another, which means that all of our lives are valued equally. And Black Lives Matter is, I think, an emphasis, I know it's an emphasis on that understanding that some communities that have valued their lives strategically, systemically throughout the way in which the society has been structured in the United States have valued those lives more importantly, that has been an error, not just in perception, but an error in understanding how we relate to each other and how we all relate to God as creator. A second image that's important for me comes out of the biblical references that's been used fairly often, at least I've seen it a good bit within church context, to come out of the teachings of Jesus, and that would be the parables in the Gospel of Luke. I think of the imagery of the lost coin and the lost sheep, where there is this emphasis on the 99, and the shepherd leaving the 99 to go after the one. In other words, that the one is valued and highly and extremely valued, and valued so much that there is an almost a sense when the one is in difficulty or in struggle or trouble, that value raises to the level of all of the 99 combined. The difficulty, of course, is when we think about that situation and circumstance, there's a lot of bleeding that's going on from the 99 because of the fact that the shepherd is paying so much attention to the one. When the shepherd wanders over the hill to see about the one, the 99 become angry. They start protesting the glories of the 99. Even if the 99 push the one out there into the pasture, rig the situation or circumstance so that the one doesn't have the same opportunity to excel and to grow within community with the 99. The the understanding is that there's something wrong with the one. That's why the one is out there. It doesn't deserve the shepherd's time. The sense of direction is out of whack. The one should learn to walk him or herself back. We would if we were in that situation or circumstance. There is this sense that those who are strong because of the circumstance in which they are born, because of the color of their skin, because of the geographical location in which they find themselves, that promotes their lives to a level of sacredness that is beyond others who don't fit into those communal, geographical, or racial categories. So I think the biblical emphasis of the stress on the one that is or has been relegated historically and in creation and in society, the biblical understanding is that God's attention and preference is toward that one. Another example that comes to mind for me is that out of Matthew 25. I've been looking at that a great deal of late because of work in my own church context, where Jesus, of course, asked, or at least the people asked the question of Jesus, where have we seen you? And Jesus, of course, in his response, wherever you have done something of support to the least of these. And of course, not least in an ontological sense in their being, but made least by the circumstances into which they were born, poverty or skin color, geographical space, all of those kinds of categories. Those who are living on the margins, on the edge, in the borderlands, that is in relationship or in valuing those lives, one values Jesus' own essence, Jesus' own identity. The understanding from that, for me, is that we need to reframe how we position ourselves, not just to God as creator, but to all of us as created. That there are not some in the center and the rest of us are on the borders, which is the way in which society, at least in the United States, has been structured, particularly from the framework of white supremacy. But we look from the frame of God, where we're all equally in border communities because God is the center. The center is not composed of white folks or wealthy folks or the politically powerful folk. The center is comprised by God. And according to the biblical story, God in the center is focused on the borders, which means all of us. It means that those of us who think we are the center of reality and create systems and structures to protect our centering in reality and societal reality, when we do that, we commit an idolatrous act if indeed God is the center. The purpose of this kind of reckoning or recognition is to let God be recognized as the one who is in the center. We decentralize and marginalize in the favor of God. We can't do that if those who hold the center pretend that they are indeed in God's place. And it's difficult to deal with that centering, because pretending to be in the center is intoxicating. God yet claims or continues to claim the center and continues to show preference to those on the margins. And I think one of the things for me from a Black faith perspective or a church perspective, the Black church perspective, is that to look at our understanding and relationship with God decenters how we understand powerful people positioning themselves in the place that belongs only to God. Another component from the biblical record that's important for me is that of universalism. When I read the material from the prophets or Jesus' own claims that that the temple is to be a house of prayer for all the nations, which is echoing the prophetic claims as well, that there's this understanding that we are all caught up together in God's plan, in God's movement, in God's breaking into this historical context. It begins with the Genesis account of all of creation that Luke and Jesus' genealogy takes us all the way back to Adam to show our kinship. Again, goes to a divine parent. We're all born of that same creator God that makes us all kin to one another through this lineage of Adam, which then links to Jesus and then to all of us within the Black church tradition and context. From that beginning point to Jesus's ministry point to the end of the biblical canon in the book of Revelation, where you have people of all nations, tongues, and tribes streaming into the New Jerusalem, there is this understanding that we, again, all find ourselves in relationship to God as creatures, as created, and therefore in kinship relationship with one another. That means that all of us, particularly those who have been denigrated historically, or those who have been cast in second position or third position historically throughout our society, be recognized as not only equal, but to be valued. The key for me in looking from this biblical perspective is that God's preference, God's prioritization is for those who have been deprioritized within the historical record. And that, I think, is one of the main, at least faith messages that comes out of the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black lives matter because Black lives are precious to God, because Black lives are as intrinsically connected to God's creative intent and creative desire as any other life on the planet. It is also a recognition that those who are denigrated individually or systemically by others are a part of God's overall design and plan and intent for redeeming and valuing. So what I'm trying to do is see not just the powerful message that comes from the Black Lives Matter movement by itself, but also to see it through the prism of the Black church, which then takes me into these biblical records and biblical materials that I think gives us a new sense of how we can orient ourselves as we think about the issues that are in front of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Were I a millennial now, I'd say this is time for your mic drop.
Oh, yeah, I don't know where the mic is on this.
As a good Baptist, I'd say it's time to raise the love offering. Thank you so much for your response, thorough response to that question. So grateful for it. Dr. Gaffney, I want to wrestle with you. I was in conversation with a number of churches recently, and they've talked about the fact that protest seems so very un-Christian, and dare I say even unbiblical. Could you talk to us a bit about the notion of protest in prophetic books and relationship to kingly power in the ancient Near Eastern world?
So you may wind up pushing on me a little bit, as you said. This was a challenging question for me as I thought about it, because the prophets function primarily as messenger prophets. That is, they are conveying messages that they have experienced from God, experienced in different ways. Some of them heard the word, some of them saw a vision. Often the expression in Hebrew is to the effect that the word happened to them. There was some kind of encounter. And so under that rubric, they are not, as women and men, and perhaps those non-binary prophets hidden under one of those two obligatory grammatical genders, they are not of themselves protesting the powers that be around them, even those prophets that for whom their books are articulated as their own words rather than the words of God, which happens quite often. So then I started thinking about the way that the prophets function, that they have basically two modes of prophetic discourse: proclamation, of course, and performance. I am being attacked by a cat, so you may see interesting movement on my side of the camera. So prophetic performance shares some resonance with contemporary protest action. But as I began to look at some of the performative prophetic interludes with which I'm most familiar, which I teach often in my courses, I started to realize that when Jeremiah does his most infamous and scandalous dirty underwear protest, if we want to call it that, he's not actually protesting power and empire. For those who don't know the story, God tells him to buy some new undergarments, wear them, get them nasty, leave them in a rock, let them get nastier, pull them out. And then they're part of a sermon. They are the object lesson. And God says to Jeremiah, you, Israel, are this filthy to me. Well, that's not protesting empire. Then I looked at Ezekiel, who does all of these things, lays on his side, cuts his hair, weighs his hair, puts on a backpack, tunnels through a wall. But he too is speaking to Israel. He is in exile and he's speaking to Israel on the DL. right? He's not speaking out loud outside, but only within the company of trusted elders. So I had to revisit this. And then I came to the understanding that perhaps one of the reasons that so much of the prophetic discourse is directed towards Israel is because not all of the harm in the community comes from outside of the community. Ask Black women. If we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, we need to talk about the Say Her Name movement. And one of the things we learned is that when we start calling the role of women who are murdered, we find that we are not all murdered by police, whether they share our race and ethnicity or not. Some of those Black women, some of those Black trans women, some of those Black cis women are killed by Black folk within the community. So I want us to hold on to that. The next thing I'd like to invite you to think about is the context of the Hebrew scriptures. The Israelites and Judeans were under oppression. They did not have access to their overlords, so the in-your-face protest was not a common resort. Moses had access because he lived in two worlds. He had a hybridized identity. Those who did speak to the representatives of colonizing empires, if they weren't the Moses model, then you have the tragicomic Jonah model. I mean, he winds up there eventually, but I imagine the Ninevite king, the Assyrian king, thought that he was a buffoon until, in that case, he heard the word and was convicted. But even then, Jonah's message was not specifically a protest about the atrocity that Nineveh and Assyria committed on the people they dominated. So I started to ask myself, is there even an analogy here? Right? I looked at Micah, Amos, and Nahum, and others in the canonical scrolls of the prophets. They addressed foreign nations rhetorically, but there's no indication they went anywhere. Their preaching was designed for Israel, to let them know that God was taking account of how these overlords were treating them, but they were not getting up in their faces and telling them about themselves. Then I thought a little bit more about the Black Lives Matter movement and the ways in which some people in that movement have been looking to professional prophets, not looking to the leaders who are in the street doing the work, looking for a clergy figure, for a next Dr. King figure. And some of those professional prophets, whose names I don't need to call, find themselves in every protest, whether they're invited or not, hogging all the mic and camera time. So maybe, just maybe, let's not look to the prophets. Let's look to the people. And so I reset on this topic. And then I looked at Shifra and Puah. Their actions in deceiving the Pharaoh and really setting up an underground movement to save the lives of babies who would be exterminated. That's protest. That's a direct protest action against a monarch who's oppressing the people. The next one is perhaps a little more obscure for some readers and hearers, and that is the anonymous man of God, as I call them, who prophesies against Jeroboam and the foreign altar that he's using in worship that is not sanctioned by the God of Israel. This happens in 1 Kings chapter 13. This text is a prophetic text in Hebrew and Jewish reckoning, because in the Hebrew order of the Bible, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are all prophetic texts. So him coming up to the monarch, getting in his face, and prophesying against his sectarian religion, against the altar on which he's all of those matters. The next one I want to leave with you is perhaps more familiar, and that's Ebed-Melech. And he is the servant in Jeremiah chapter 38 who literally saves Jeremiah because he goes to the king and protests the unjust treatment and the way people have conspired against Jeremiah. So I found myself circling back around to some examples, but only after I really thought through what is it that the prophets are doing, to whom are they speaking, and on whose behalf? Obviously, God. The last example I want to leave you is what I call my Malcolm X example. And that is that Deborah, as the head of the coalition of tribes who answered to her, waged and won a war, which is perhaps the ultimate act of protest against a tyrant who oppressed her and her people for 20 years. And I'll leave it there so we can have some conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for delving down deeply on that and giving us some answers that might have been not those that we would have expected, but some interesting characters. I especially appreciate the Shipra and Puha example as I think an early expression of a Black lives, other lives matter movement within an oppressive regime. Thank you so much for that larger question. My next question is for Reverend Henderson Belcito. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd uprisings, how have church communities changed their approaches to communal interpretations of justice? Have churches gathered a larger understanding of what justice means because of these new uprisings?
I certainly hope so, Dr. Sadler. I will say—
we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Oh, am I still muted? Can you hear me? Okay. One of the things I want to say one thing before I forget in response to what Dr. Gaffney said. One of the protests that came to mind as I thought about it and as I listened to you were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Like they are being told, worship this despot. And they say, we're not going to do it. No matter what you say, no matter how much trouble we get into, we believe our God will rescue us and make this right. And even if God does not rescue us, we will not bow down. And I just hope that that is exactly where we are headed as churches, as the church, as the community of faith. I think about my context here in Charlotte, and I think about churches that I have known and been involved with here. Some churches are at one end of the spectrum where they have not, until now, they really haven't taken these conversations seriously, right? So they have sort of dismissed Black Lives Matter conversations. They have not engaged in communal justice. And so for them, there are some new things happening now, right? So there are 21-day challenges happening. Churches that would never have affiliated themselves with this kind of thing before now have Black Lives Matter banners. People are showing up in conversations. And I know that some are showing up to listen and to learn rather than thinking that they can lead the way. I think that it's important for churches that have not previously been involved in these conversations and in this kind of justice work, show up and join what is already happening. Follow the lead of people that are already doing this work. Join in what God is already doing in our community through our churches. And then at the other end of the spectrum, as we know, and we certainly have touched on and will continue to talk about, is Black churches, right? So Black churches have been doing this work of justice and speaking up and laying our lives on the line since the very beginning, since the hush arbors, right? That people have been protesting, people have been saying our lives matter. And so many of those churches, many of the descendants of those blessed ancestors are now saying, okay, welcome to the work. We've been doing this, join us, listen, learn, and follow. Don't think that you can come and lead the way. And what I think is also happening is that in some of these cases, churches that come, white churches, especially Presbyterian churches, that's where we are located, can bring their money, bring their influence, bring their connection, bring their all of that to the work that's already being done, but also learning to do that from the back row, not from a position of leading. So we have some extreme, sort of the ends of the spectrum. And then in the middle, we have churches like I serve at Caldwell Presbyterian here in Charlotte, a church that has been doing some of this work for a while, right? So we've been involved with LGBT kinds of issues and other issues related to justice. And now we too are pushing ourselves farther in this conversation. So Caldwell has done some work. Rodney, you were involved in it and helping us understand our history related to to enslaved people, and how the money that founded this church came from a family that believed that it owned other people. And so we are learning to reckon with that. What does that mean? How do we deal with that as a community? Do we create a monument? How do we tell that story in a way that honors these people? And then so we're doing the work, but we also know we need to do more. And that's what that's what we always hear. We hear that from within the community. We hear that from without, that we must do more. There's always more to do. And that is absolutely true. Now, the thing is, we recognize on two levels that we are not alone in this, right? We have this great creator God for whom all life is a reflection of God's own life, right? And so God, who created us, is with us. The Spirit of God fills us and empowers us to do this work. Christ's life was the supreme example of doing this justice work, of showing that lepers' lives, that women's lives, that people who were ill, people who were hungry, people who were poor, people who were marginalized in their time. Jesus spoke very strongly against the religious community at that time that continued to keep those people on the margin. And so Jesus' own life sets that example. So we are not alone because of who we believe in, and we are not alone because it's not just Christian churches that are doing this work. I mean, here in Charlotte, we have this amazing organization, MECMEN, right, which is over 100 faith communities of all kinds, bringing resources, information, time, energy together to say Black Lives Matter, and to say we are going to do our work together as people of all different kinds of faith traditions and no faith tradition at all. We will do this work together. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that there has been a shift in our understanding and our approach to this interpretation of justice. Now, I am reminded of what Cornel West so famously said, right? That justice is what love looks like in public. So if we are going to claim God so loved the world, if we're going to throw that verse at people and put it up on signs in football end zones, then we have to recognize that includes the whole world. And so our call as the church, our call as people of faith, is to step out into the world, to bring ourselves, our energy, our money, our influence, our presence into the world, to help them see what this love of the God we claim to know and to love, what that love looks like in public.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that perspective. But thank you for also contextualizing it in your own context, in dare I say, an interesting church in today's world, one that is white and Black, straight and not straight, that has so many different manifestations within its identity. I wonder if your church is unique in this regard, or if other churches, and I'll mess with that a little bit later on. But right now, I want to talk to my colleague, Dr. Bridgman. We all know you are not just a brilliant scholar. We work together with the Africana Bible as your editor on that. We know of you as an incredible preacher. Woman Preach was your baby, your idea, bringing this to the forefront. We know of you as now a dean of a seminary, so a great leader in so many ways. But most people don't know that you are also an artist. And one of the things that I remember really having a great conversation with you years ago about was the way that art is useful in the development of movements. I want you to reflect for a moment on the role that art plays in contemporary movements, but particularly the Black Lives Matter movement. We can't hear you. You're muted.
I was trying to save y'all from my coughing, from my allergies, and forgot to unmute. Sorry about that. First of all, thank you all. I'm really glad to be here and glad to be a part of this conversation. You know, Nikki Finney, who was poetry award-winning poet who is in Kentucky, once said that the role of the poet is the role of the artist in times of chaos and struggle is to pay attention and to document. And so in every movement, poets do that. Artists do that. That's what the psalmists are doing sometimes. They're documenting movements, right? By the rivers of Babylon, there we sit down. They required of us a song, you know. So it's this whole, the way in which the artist has to articulate the heart of the people. And the way it's showing up now, it's very interesting that the Smithsonian's National African American History and Culture Museum of African American History and Culture has gone down to the Lafayette Plaza and other places where people are protesting this summer in DC to capture signs and other things that have been produced to make sure that they have a record of the art that is being produced on the streets. In the Baltimore uprising, there were several murals that were produced. Right now in Minneapolis, there are several murals that are being produced. Both Newsweek, Vanity Fair have both reported on these pieces of art. It's showing up in music. What the Hell You Talking About by Janelle Monáe came out in 2012, 2014, in a direct protest kind of way. Kendrick Lamar's We're Gonna Be All Right has become a protest anthem. Beyonce's Black Parade, Get Information also have become part of the protest art. What I'm trying to say is, particularly in Black movements, I'm not saying it doesn't happen in any movement, but since we're talking about the movement for Black lives, nothing happens without the artists showing up, right? And so it'll be interesting to me in 20 years when we can get all these poems that are being written, these songs that are being sung, capture the murals. Right now, there is a digital mural account, trying to keep up with the art that's coming in from all over. We're capturing it in ways now that we couldn't in the 60s, 1960s. Like, we lost probably millions of pieces of art in the 60s and only captured a little bit of what was being created. But protest happens always, at least in Black settings, with the artist bringing forth a dance and a song, a hum as well, because it's a way of saying you're not going to kill our spirit. I'll put it in churchese. The world, this joy I have, the world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away. So we will line dance our way in the middle of a protest while somebody is burning sage. Somebody will make up a song on the spot while somebody is writing a poem about what's happening right now. And then you'll have people like Pamela Lightsey out capturing it on video, and other people documenting it, making documentaries of it. So the Ferguson uprising has an amazing documentary, Whose Streets, that happened really almost in time while it's happening. So my point is that the artists are integral to the movement for Black lives. They're not on the periphery. They're not on the sidelines. They are happening. And I would say that those of us who are not going to be named, nothing I draw is going to show up on anything. But one of the ways that we artists and others manage our rage is we get it out on paper, right? We it out on the canvas, or Dr. Gaffney uses water paint, watercolor. I use acrylics, and I'm a poet. So, and that, it may not look like it's helping the larger movement, but it helps create for me space so I can be useful in other ways. It shows up in our preaching as well, which is also an art form in Black churches. And some people are better at that art form than others. But there are people who shape their sermons so that they are poetic and artistic in a way that people will remember certain phrases. And it's never a treatise. They aren't simply just trying to, quote, make you believe, or a faith proposition. They literally are trying to move you, because that's what art is supposed to do. So that's what I want to add to the conversation to start.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all panelists for your initial conversations. And at this point in time, I want us to open up this next series of questions to us all, and please jump in as you feel led to do. I want to start with this question, which is a question that I've heard several times over the course of the conversations we've had over the summer. And there is no one answer to this. I've heard numerous answers that seem to be hitting on important parts of this question. Is there a role in the movement for Black lives for white churches? Is there a place for white allies in this movement, but particularly those who are in big steeple white Southern churches that are part of the purview of our seminary? Please, Gail.
I would definitely jump in and say, yes, there is definitely a role for white churches. I mean, I believe that this is the issues that we are facing, the issues that we're talking about here are not issues that were created by Black people. And so white people who are in these churches need to be talking about it. They need to be thinking about it. They need to be learning about it, and they need to be acting on it. And, you know, Rodney, you pointed a little bit to this earlier about the church where I'm involved, which is the predominantly white Peace USA church, as many of them are. And our senior minister, my colleague, John Cleghorn, Justin Martin, who's our youth minister, they have been out there doing the work in the protests. You know, Justin got pepper sprayed by the police out there. So, I mean, yes, ministers and members of these congregations must get out and learn and also line themselves up with this work of justice. Absolutely.
I was in Ferguson a year after Michael Brown Jr. was murdered, killed, and I was standing in front of the. We were there in front of the jail. They had arrested some Black protesters, and they had put yellow tape around a public building, daring protesters to cross it. And the leader of the protest said, "Where are my white people?" And the white people raised their hands. They said, "You go first." Because what they knew in Ferguson is that those police officers weren't actually planning on arresting any white people, but they also weren't prepared for white people to storm the yellow tape. And so, yes, there was a place for them. I have a lot of caveats around this, though. One is get information, learn how to follow. I have such. I was having a conversation with one of my white colleagues yesterday, who is in total despair right now because the late Supreme Justice Ginsburg has passed, and what's going to happen, and blah blah blah. And aren't you depressed? There's a Black woman. I was like, white people are doing what white people do. I can't afford to be depressed. He said, aren't you? I said, I don't do justice work because I expect for it to work. I do it out of a sense of faithfulness. And when it works, I consider it one of the great miracles of God. So come, I don't like allyship, come and see yourself as a co-conspirator, as somebody who also needs to be set free, because ain't none of us free until all of us are free. So you're coming to help the poor Black people is not freedom work for me. And you see that your life is bound to mine, bound to ours, then it matters to me that you're there. And the last thing I'll say about this is these are all based in real stories. I had a colleague say to me that he had been taken out of his grandmother's will because he was talking about racial justice, and he had been uninvited to Thanksgiving dinner. They had told him never to come back again in the South, but it could have been in the North, because let's not act like this is just a Southern problem. And I said to him, so that piece where it says, if you give up father and mother and sister and brother to follow me, you can be in my reign. Is that kind of what's going on here? And he got red in the face and he said, I've lost everything. I said, welcome to the gospel.
Thank you. Thank you. Very rich. Anyone else want to jump in on this one?
Right. I think that they've answered that question, and there's not much more, I don't think, to be said. I will point out one of the gifts of the Black Lives Matter movement has been that you've seen a cross section of communities in the protest movement, and you've seen the value of multi-generational, multiracial, multicultural, multigender, multisexuality. You've seen the power when you have diverse groupings of people come forward to speak for justice for a particular oppressed community of people, as African Americans have been oppressed in this country. So there is value that we've already seen in that. So not only is it helpful for white Christians to be a part of it, it is demonstrated, I think, that this coalition of folk protesting has been incredibly valuable. The other thing I would say is, you know, Rodney, that right after George Floyd's murder, I wrote a piece for the seminary community on the topic that white Christians have not done enough with regard to anti-racism in the country. And so again, I would say not only is there room, there is a necessity, there is a compulsion for white Christians to live into the message of the gospel that they have been proclaiming for centuries in this country. This is an opportunity to live into what one believes. And it's not just an opportunity,
Thank
it's a
you
mandate.
for that, and I love that notion. So it sounds like there's not only a place for it, not only should white churches be involved, white Christian communities be involved, but there has been a diverse movement so far. And there is almost, and I love the way that you said this, Dr. Bridgman, you need to see that your freedom is tied up in seeking our freedom, because we're not free until we are all free. I want to sort of shift the gears just a little bit, because I've heard this over and over again as well, that the evangelical church has found a problem with the notion of Black Lives Matter, that Black Lives Matter isn't a true, authentic Christian message. A true, authentic Christian message should be all lives matter. What are your reactions to statements like this from the evangelical movement? Dr. Gaffney?
So it's a visceral anti-Black response that Blackness provokes a response like an allergic reaction. It's tied up also in a sense of corporate guilt and shame. This is a meme, but there's something true underneath it, as there often is, and that is white fear of retribution, that we would do to them what they did to us for 400 years. So there is this deep terror that's also socially constructed around Blackness, once Blackness was codified as evil and the devil and the boogeyman. So there is that visceral reaction that they have not been willing to overcome or taken the time to learn about, to understand. I mean, we still have people denying that there is white supremacy. One of the stories of Justice Ginsburg's life unfolding was that she had to convince the male justices that there was such a thing as discrimination against women in an era where women couldn't get a library card without a husband, but there was question and doubt as to whether or not that was an oppressive system, right? Whether that was discrimination. So we have that same situation where people simply refuse to believe that there is a white supremacist infrastructure. The second piece is again, using biblical and Christian language, since that's our context, unwilling to be teachable, which is something the text calls us to be. And so the simple paradigm of I'm inviting you all to invest and support this effort to fight breast cancer by no means means that childhood leukemia does not matter, right? We focus on what is emergent and urgent. And so the unwillingness to accept that and to be honest conversation partners stems from a cultivated and nurtured anti-Blackness and, to quote the gospel according to PE, fear of a Black planet.
Thank you. I appreciate that response. Dr. Jones, did you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I think, Black Lives Matter is an inherent theological statement. And I want to say that with this sense that my advisor, Dr. Joanne Terrell, she always starts out her theology classes with this phrase that theology is God taught, but it is not God who is doing the talking. It is humanity in our quest to understand ourselves, God, and our relationships to others. And in part of that quest, right, that which has been marginalized, discarded, those who exist on the side of the oppressed, right, and reclaiming a sense of value for those on the margins is a we are theologically called, right, to be concerned for the least and the left out, the downtrodden, the depressed and oppressed. And so an affirmation of Black life as sacred, as made in the image of God, as holy, right, particularly in a world that will suggest otherwise, that suggests suffocation and asphyxiation, a statement that says, I can't breathe, right, in a world, right, that is really taking the spirit and life breath, the life force out of Black lives. To make those declarative statements is theological. And so a part of that is not, I think this question of the evangelical movement on kind of seeing it as unchristian, to me, I cannot fathom that, because I think it is doing exactly what Jesus has called us to do in terms of, valuing that which has been cast aside.
Thank you so much for that. Anybody else want to jump in on this question?
I just want to say it's a little bit like the story of the Good Samaritan, when one might say Samaritan lives matter, and the temple priest and Levi who passed by would say, well, so do ours. I thought a biblical text might help some people, since the accusation is that we don't know Bible. I want to say Samaritan lives matter.
There is, because you could also look at the Syrophoenician woman who would fit into a similar category. Or, it's somewhat akin to saying that Jesus said, I came to preach good news to the poor, a specific reference to his being here in the incarnation, God's invasion for the poor. And then the rest of us who are not poor are saying, well, wait a minute, that's unchristian to believe that God prefers the poor, those who are specifically set aside. What about the rest of us? There is intentionality in God's movement, and God's intentionality is apparent. From all the materials we see in the New Testament through the imagery of Jesus, God's intentionality is pretty focused on those who are marginalized. That says something about the Black Lives Matter movement and how it is. I would think to be central to Jesus's emphasis and concerns.
Thank you for that. Gail, did you want to jump in? Excellent. Well, thank you for all those responses. And I think that we continue to struggle. There was a question from the audience, and I'm afraid to raise this as a question here. But this could be a dangerous one, but I think it's a necessary question. Is the evangelical movement a Christian movement at all?
I think we have to be careful about saying that Christians who do not conform to a certain set of expectations are not Christian, because what we wind up doing is excluding all of the problematic manifestations of Christianity. So that when we say, oh, the Christians who supported the Holocaust, they weren't really Christians, then we wind up absolving ourselves of our ancestral guilt. And the same with the enslavers, and the same with those who use Christianity to condone battering women and battering children. So it's a dangerous proposition to say that all of these other people aren't Christian because they're not doing it my way, even when your way is an attempt to follow the heart of the gospel as you understand it. We have to acknowledge that Christianity has a white supremacist expression, and that there are people who made the same confessions that we make and take the same sacraments that we take, and we're still able to put on their white sheet, go out and lynch someone, put their knee on somebody's neck, go into an A&E church and murder people at Bible study, right? We have to contend with the violence that is internal to Christianity in its Western expression. Not that there isn't any in other expressions, that's just the one under which we live. And the ways in which white supremacy is nearly unable to be disentangled from American Christianities of all sorts.
Interesting. Thank you. I almost want to problematize this question and say, I hear what you're saying, but I wonder if there's a way of interpreting this question as not whether or not there are problematic expressions of Christianity, but does this this perspective, the way that contemporary evangelicalism is expressed, is it authentically Christian at its core? Does it represent the core of the faith?
I would continue to support what Dr. Gaffney was saying, in that that is a difficult question to answer. I mean, I will, full confession, full disclosure, I have come through that movement, right? I was born and raised and spent most of my life in evangelical churches. And so I think that we need to be clear that there are evangelical churches that are doing the work that we are talking about here. So there's not a broad and blank thing that we can say about all evangelical churches or the entire movement. And also, I imagine that there's probably a panel discussion happening somewhere right now in which they're saying, are those Presbyterians even Christians? So I think that we need to recognize that people are looking, it's easy to point a finger. I do believe that there are problems that need to be brought out and called out, and people need to be called into conversation to say, help me understand how you ground this in your faith. Help me understand how you ground this in the teachings of Christ and in the understanding of the prophets and the scripture that we claim to hold dear. But I think that, to say that the whole thing may or may not be Christian, I would tread very lightly on that.
Thank you.
I think I would echo that, Rod. And one of the concerns for me is to go back, as we all know, I think, historically in the first century, for example, when Christianity was becoming a movement, before it was Christianity, we recognized it was not just a Christianity, they were Christianities. They were all already in the first century competing with one another for an understanding of who or which one most adequately and appropriately represented what God was doing through the movement that developed through Jesus of Nazareth. So there's always been this kind of competitiveness about who actually represents what God is doing through Christ. Mm-hmm. It seems to me a better question might be, not is the evangelical movement a Christian movement, because then you're overgeneralizing to a whole swath of believers who are trying to live into how they understand God is moving through Jesus Christ in the world. Mm-hmm. But be more specific and say, at those moments when evangelical Christians or non-evangelical Christians do not live into the kind of representation of God's inbreaking in the world that is developed through Jesus of Nazareth, then there's a problem. There's a problem. So when you have an evangelical Christian say that Black Lives Matter is an unchristian thing, there's a problem. That's not representative of how God's moving through Jesus of Nazareth. We've been talking about that, how that develops in the text. So for me, it's not labeling an entire faith movement problematic, but looking at how people within that faith movement live out that faith and then calling into question when it does not fit into what it proclaims to intend or proclaims to believe. You don't live what you believe or what these biblical records that are foundational for you express.
Thank you. Dr. Bridget?
So again with the problematizing. I agree in a very uncomfortable way, but part of the reason is because I have been weeding, and one of the things that I've learned in weeding is it is sometimes impossible not to pull up a rose bush when you're trying to pull up weeds, or pull up the flower when you're trying to weed a bed. I'm just discovering this. Not that I didn't always know this, because I grew up on a farm, and so it's helped me understand the wheat and tares parable a little bit. And here's what I mean by that with regard to this particular question. I grew up evangelical as well. I did not grow up with white evangelicalism, white supremacist thinking. I did not. But I did grow up believing Jesus is my personal savior, and that I had to accept Jesus as my personal savior. And I didn't go through confirmation, because you don't do that as an evangelical. You have believer's baptism. I wasn't baptized as a child, because you have believer's baptism. So here's the problem. The word evangelical has been co-opted by a movement. And because of that, it is not a theology unto itself. It is literally wheat and tares, bastardized. And it's hard for me to sit here and say, all evangelicals, it's not Christian. I'm like, but I know too many evangelicals who are Christian, who actually don't espouse to what is being assigned as evangelical Christianity, the 94% people who voted for the current occupant of the White House. So I think it is true. We have to call people out and in, Gail, out and in. And I think it's true, Dr. Gaffney, that that it needs to be problematized, that we have to hold all of ourselves accountable. I'm watching the chat, and people are saying, well, won't Jesus say to some, I never knew you? And I'm like, yeah, Jesus will say that, but I ain't Jesus. And I mean, I can point to people and say, that doesn't line up with what I understand about the biblical text here, or what I understand about the nature of God. I don't understand how you could possibly think lynching somebody and taking pictures with them is a Christian thing. That is not of God. And I'm willing to say that. I'm willing to say that. I am not willing to say that everybody went to that church even believed that that person should be at a lynching. If that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for your responses. Is there anybody else that wanted to get on that question?
When I hear that question, I'm thinking about this kind of sense that Christianity has had this kind of collusion with power since Constantine. And really, not this question, but I'll answer it in my own way. Really, there is a kind of concern, even from Black Lives Matter protesters, about the church not being a friendly place to the movement. Right. So I think that is some consideration that needs to take place. And perhaps, right, we might say that the civil rights movement was a Black church movement, right? Even though it didn't have as many participants and or followers that the Black Lives Matter movement has today, as it has become the largest movement in U.S. history, right? But there is a sense that, because churches haven't been out front in this movement, that there is a kind of sense that Christians and other kind of faith communities see this as not a movement to participate in. And I want to say that is problematic, that if we as Christians, or even as people of faith, don't see that if we are not the leaders or the persons who form or start or even are the head or hierarchical structures that lead movements, then there is no reason for us to participate, does not really show the kind of Christian to do just, to walk humbly, right, to love mercifully, kind of attributes and virtues that we ascribe to. These are acts that are unchristian. And so I want to have a sense, or for us to really deal with the fact that Christians and faith communities have a way of making space for Black Lives Matter protesters in ways, and activists and other organizations and coalitions in ways that they might be a part of the movement, even if they are not the persons who form it or structure it.
Thank you.
So I know for sure that I'm touchy about this, that I feel real tender about this, because I've been a member of Black Lives Movement since day one, as has several of the people I know who are ministers. And to get on the bus ride to Ferguson in October, right after Michael Brown Jr. was murdered, I don't know how many, but a whole group of those people were ordained ministers, and they went straight to St. John's of the Beloved Church that hosted Black Lives Matter on the ground in Ferguson. And that has been true literally throughout the country. So I think when people say the Black churches are there, what they mean is they can't put their hand on an MLK Jr. style person. They don't count Tracy Blackman as a leader in Black Lives Matter, or they don't count, I could name a whole bunch of other people right now. They're looking for a Black man, one Black man to stand up. So when Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of movements, say we are leaderful, that is to say that there are many people leading us, because you're not going to chop off the head of this movement. If there are many of us who are leaders. That includes many of us who are Christian, many of us who are Muslim, many of us who are Buddhist, but are faithful and are part of this movement. So I think even, and I am going to call it a falsehood, the falsehood that the church is not present in BLM is that. It's a falsehood. Tracy Blackman is just a name, but she ain't the only one. When I tell you Will Gaffney was on the streets in Fort Worth, well, I am constantly on the streets in Columbus, Ohio, and with the Black Lives Movement people, as is literally hundreds of other Black leaders, church leaders. I just want to say that that's a part of the narrative that I really want us to disabuse people of.
And I would probably just say one quick thing. I would just say one quick thing related to that as well. And that is the fact that there are so many women involved in this, right? And Black women. So if we're going to talk about, the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Women's Leadership, and we're going to talk about we have to talk about the fact that when Black women are leading or part of a leaderful organization and stepping up and preaching and speaking and moving in this way, that in itself causes some people to turn away. That in itself causes some people to deny the truth and the power of the work that is happening, because we know that history and we know why. And that just provides yet another reason for people to discount. As you said, they're looking for one man to run this thing, and that's no longer the model.
Amen. Thank you for all of those answers. And I'm struggling right now with another kind of question. I remember in the aftermath of the death of Mike Brown, I saw the uprising that took place in Ferguson and thought that some significant things would begin to change in our country. And there was a significant movement, the longest movement that I think we've ever had in our nation's history in terms of protests. But it didn't force the kind of change that we need to see. I thought after Tamir Rice that people would recognize that if your child could be killed in this way, then certainly we need to make changes. And it came to naught, unfortunately, after Eric Garner, after Breonna Taylor initially, after what happened to her, an innocent woman killed in her home, that there would be a change. But it seems as though after the George Floyd murders, and perhaps because that was so close to Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, but after that, there seemed to be a change in the country. Are we at a kairotic moment when actual change is possible, where we can actually see a future? I know we're in the 401st year after 1619. Is this potential for theological and then actual change to come about?
So I think we are seeing theological change, to use your term, hearts and minds. But we have to understand that white supremacy is a self-sustaining system. And as a system, it is the embodiment of evil. So even though there are individuals who want to see specific structural changes, and there are people in different levels of government and society who have an interest in those changes and some power and authority, the system has such deep iniquitous roots that it's not enough for people to agree something has to change and want to see something change. Just one issue, the way police unions are set up means that it doesn't matter what a local jurisdiction wants or what the people want or how we vote or how many people have had their eyes open and are committed to working for justice, right? There are structures, legal and financial structures that have to be dismantled. And when you look at what some of the outcomes were after the massive outpourings of people on every continent on this planet, there were very few legislative and constructive changes that could be brought to pass, right? Even after the NBA protests, opening up arenas to take pressure off of polls, because we know that's one form of voter suppression. That's really important. But structural changes in how police function and how they interact with citizens, we're not at a place where we can do that. We're not at a place where we can hold police officers accountable in certain ways because their unions have negotiated for them the privilege of seeing statements and having time to prepare statements and not being legally liable for lying in their statements. So it's not about the heartswell and uprising of the people. We need to systematically unravel and deconstruct the structures that are perpetuating white supremacy and at the same time indoctrinating new generations of followers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else?
I mean, I would add to that in terms of actual change, I'm thinking about the ways in which in Richmond and in other parts that the monuments, certain Confederate monuments and statues have literally been torn down, pushed down, dragged down. And a sense that this is a conversation or conversations that have needed to be had over decades and perhaps even over centuries that must happen now. And I think, in terms of social movements, as long as there is, in my view, embodied protest, as long as there is still this kind of movement and way in which the demonstration is concrete, physical, and actually puts bodies on the lines, I think that is always an indication that social change is not only possible, but there will be reckoning. And we might notice some of the ways in which social movements have fallen is when they no longer understood the really kind of the value of putting our bodies on the line out front and up against. That when we dismiss that value or say we want to move from protest to politics only, or from these kinds of swift kind of moves over to something that we might think may be institutionally substantial, we also see a falling off of that actual social change. And so in order for there to continue to be social change, I think that there needs to continue to be a sense of putting our bodies on the line in whatever ways that we can, whether it's on the street, in the classroom, in the church, right? That makes it visible and upfront that we're physically holding space and revealing that Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this? I'm sorry, Brian.
Well, I was going to jump in, Rodney, and then I thought I would pull back because I don't even myself question what I would say. I tend to be an optimist on most things, and I'm going to say I'm a little pessimistic on this because of the human nature, the whole sense of who we are as people. You ask about an almost, kind of like from a biblical sense, kind of a flashpoint, apocalyptic kind of goal point that you're looking for, a telos, a goal. When will it happen? And I'm reminded, and in the biblical material, Jesus is always telling his people, "Well, stop looking for it." I mean, you don't know when the time will come, and so that brings me, to what Melanie was saying. The work of putting our bodies in play and in harm's way to press forward for change. That's the work that we continue. That's how we watch. That's how we carry ourselves during this very difficult period. What concerns me is that we as we as Americans tend to push ourselves up to the edge before we decide it's time to do something to make an adjustment. I mean, even in little things, we'll dicker about whether we put a stop sign up until someone has a traffic accident or someone gets hit by a car. Then, okay, yeah, we need to do something about it. We're seeing this prolonged dickering about the value of Black lives that has lasted for 4 centuries now. We're still dickering about it as if we don't know the how valuable a reality this is. And what frightens and worries me is that it will take a significant event that seems to me our society is pushing us toward before we recognize that we need to make significant and deep systemic changes. I mean, we're right now at a place where we have creation itself. I mean, this virus. We have the whole climate crisis that's swirling around us, and we have this racial reckoning that's going on in the same way. And still, many of us don't see that there is a significant problem. Don't see that there is a need to transform how we live our lives. That suggests a brokenness that needs to be reckoned with as well. In the end, I'm an optimist because I think that God does intervene. I truly believe that, and God will find a way to intervene. I think it will be intervening through, as Melanie was saying, the work of our Black bodies and white bodies and other bodies working in concert together. But one fears that it will be worse before it's better.
Thank you. Thank you for all of those responses. Thank you, panel, for all of your this thoughtful answers to the questions that I posed tonight. And I want to end by giving you some space to just give some final words. And maybe if we can limit it to about a minute and a half each, we can all get our space in. I know I'm looking at a number of incredible preachers, so this is going to be difficult to do. I'm going to start with you, Will, and ask you, as you frame your question, what do we need to do to be faithful to the work of Black Lives Matter as people of faith? What do we need to do to be involved, be active in this? You're muted.
People who cherish life. I'm framing your question. Not Christians, not people of faith, not people who practice a religious tradition or have an ethical tradition, a moral tradition. People who value human life must be involved in the fight to preserve human life. It's that basic. At whatever status we live and work and congregate in whatever way, bring our resources to bear. It is a movement that requires political engagement, theological engagement, artistic engagement, rhetorical engagement, and modeling of best practices. It's also a commitment that involves risk. We didn't talk tonight about the fact that more than 5,000 faculty members of all religious traditions and none went on strike and did not teach for 2 days in many cases to call attention to these injustices And some of them did so in states where striking is illegal and are now being punitively pursued. If we're going to do this work, we have to risk income, risk name, risk reputation, and sometimes we're going to have to risk our lives.
Thank you. Thank you for the framing, and thank you for the challenge to risk. Gail.
So I would say, looking forward and holding on to staying faithful in this work, I think we have to do the short-term work, which is making sure people vote. We need to make sure people understand what's at stake. We need to make sure that those who are hungry, those Black lives, those Black bodies that are hungry are being fed, and those that are not in housing find places to live, even if that's some of that is short-term work, but some of that's long-term work, which is building affordable housing and doing the work of changing the laws and standing, this is going to go on for a long, long time. As Dr. Bridgman was saying, about the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like that. Yes, we have a long way to go, but it's not all going to happen through the Supreme Court. And in fact, they have not always been on our side. So we have to do short-term work. We have to do long-term work. And I think I will follow what Dr. Blunt said, and the folks at my church know this about me. I'm the hope dealer, right? So I'm always going to be the one who says we must hang on to hope. We must hang on to trust. We know that, y'all can quote scripture far better than I can, right? We have that Hall of Fame in Hebrews of all those people for whom faith was counted to them as righteousness, and the ones who got cut in half, the ones who did not get their children back. And we may be among those, and we still have to hold on to faith and hold on to trust to do the short-term work, the long-term work, and know that God has it all in God's hands.
Amen. Thank you. Dr. Bridgman.
Just start by unmuting. I just want to say amen to what's already been said, and I would add this, that if you are going to be involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, you find the local chapter and stand on the X where they tell you to stand, and follow the leader. I mean, play Simon Says with the people who are already leading. Don't give unsolicited advice to people who have already taken bullets and tear gas to the face. Trust me, they know what they're talking about and what they're doing. Give to the legal fund. If you have resources, put your money where your mouth is. That's how you can help as a person of faith. Pray, and then build the kind of structures that provide for people places of respite. So during the Montgomery bus boycott, there were people who drove cars, people who cooked meals, people who provided other ways to make money for people who lost their jobs because they were protesting. Build the kind of infrastructure that help protesters live beyond the protest while we're building the plane.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jones?
I would add, I think in the face of multiple pandemics, that we have a moral imperative to resist and embody that resistance, whether it is protest, whether it is through our actions of through gifts, or even by making space in our churches. One of the things that I'm reminded of is that even some of the local libraries, when Black Lives Matter groups signed up to get space in order to meet there, they were turned away. So how beneficial will it be if even our church communities, particularly that have space available, would open up their space in order for folks to be able to gather and to organize and strategize? So I think that we have that moral imperative, and that resistance can show up in a multiplicity of ways for our churches, for our communities, and for ourselves.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Blunt.
Well, in the book of Revelation, there is a draconian force that's taken over the world. And John, who writes that book, is concerned because his people don't protest against it. They don't act against it, because they're fearful that their lives will be disrupted, that their lives will be, in many cases, lost. His concern is that his people are quiet in their churches, and he believes that God is angry with them because they're quiet. I think one of the things we might want to ask ourselves is, in a world where it does appear that evil is possessing life in many, many different ways, if our lives are quiet, are we working with God?
Thank you for that. Thank you, each and every one of our panelists, for your wonderful responses. I have never been involved with a panel of such brilliant, wonderful people before. Dr. Gaffney, want to say thank you. Reverend Henderson Belcito, I want to say thank you. Dr. Bridgman, I want to say thank you. My colleague, Melanie, I want to say thank you. My president, Dr. Blunt, I want to say thank you. Thank you all for what you have done, what you have said. Thank you for reframing this conversation in a way that makes sense, not just in the Christian context, but beyond, as people of faith. And I just want to end with this riff that is in my head now from a song, artistic expression born out of protest. We who believe in free and justice cannot rest. We who believe in justice cannot rest until it comes. I want to bring this to a conclusion today, but I want to remind you all that we're going to have another similar conversation on the 13th of October, where we'll have a Just Talk Just, that's called When Home is a Dangerous Place, Breonna Taylor, and American Domestic Terror. We pray that you will join us again for that conversation. Again, thank you to our brilliant panel, and thank you all for coming out and joining with us tonight. We really appreciate your presence with us, and we have work to do. Let's go out, let's get involved, and let's make sure that this movement achieves its objective. Black Lives Matter. God bless.